Even after signing the divorce paper, I walk away with my 11 years old daughter and an old photo album. Hi, welcome to Family Revenge. Enjoy my new story.
After 23 years of marriage, I walked out of the courthouse with practically nothing: a rotting house, my 11-year-old daughter, and an old family photo album. My ex-husband drove off in his BMW, already celebrating keeping his millions and the company I quietly ran for 15 years. He thought he had completely stripped me of my power. But while he was celebrating his perfect victory, I was planning his downfall. My ex-husband would never expect the secrets hidden inside that photo album. I'm so grateful you're here with me today. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Your country, your city? I love knowing who's in this room with me. A note: this story contains some fictional elements woven in for storytelling and reflection. Any names or places are coincidental, but what it has to say, I believe, is worth hearing. The morning my 23-year marriage officially ended, the sky over Fairmont Heights was still the same flat gray it had been for weeks, as if even the weather had stopped trying. I drove myself. Not because no one offered. My sister had called twice the night before, and Sandra had offered to meet me in the parking lot, but because I needed those 12 minutes alone on the road, just the sound of the engine and the defroster working against the frost. I scraped ice off my windshield at 7:15 outside the house on Clearwater Drive, the house that wasn't mine anymore, where I had watched our oak tree grow tall enough for Lily to climb, and drove downtown through a January morning that felt like the inside of an empty room. Courtroom 4B, Magistrate Delgado, second floor Civil Division. I walked out at 9:17 in the morning holding a single sheet of paper, a property deed. 412 Birchwood Lane, a 3-bedroom wood-frame house built in the early 1970s, set at the end of a cul-de-sac on the east side of town. The roof leaked whenever it rained hard. The furnace rattled and gave out whenever the temperature dropped below 20 degrees, which in a Midwest January was more often than not. Rick's grandmother had left it to him years before we married. He had never once mentioned wanting to fix it. He had certainly never mentioned wanting to keep it. And now, by the terms of our settlement, it was mine. That was what I walked out with. The house nobody else wanted. A folded deed with my name alone at the top. Just my name, nothing beside it, and $650 a month in child support. Sandra Cole, my attorney, had told me 2 weeks before the hearing, sitting across from me in her office on Meridian Street, "Maggie, without formal documentation of your income, I cannot argue your contributions the way the court requires. No W-2s, no independent tax filings, 15 years managing the books for his company, and almost none of it leaves a paper trail under your name." I had managed Rick's accounts receivable, vendor contracts, quarterly projections, cash flow reports. I knew that business the way a surgeon knows the inside of a body, by instinct, by feel, by having learned where things went wrong before anyone else could see it. But I had done it without a job title, without an employment agreement, without anything on paper that might raise concerns from Rick's investors about the arrangement. He had called it keeping things clean. I had called it trust. Trust, it turned out, was not admissible in a court of law. The courtroom had been cold that morning. Institutional cold, the kind that seeps through old walls regardless of the thermostat. Rick sat across the table in his navy suit, the one he wore when he needed to appear unhurried and reasonable. His attorney spoke most of the time. Rick answered when asked, kept his voice even, and smiled once small and controlled when the magistrate confirmed the asset division. The investment accounts his, the commercial portfolio his, the vehicles his, the 3-bedroom wood frame on Birchwood with the failing roof, and the rattling furnace mine. I watched him sign his name at the bottom of the paperwork. I watched his face while he did it. No hesitation, no flicker of anything I could name. And I thought, I do not recognize this man. Not because it surprised me, but because I realized sitting there that I was not certain I ever had. Lily was in the hallway when I came out. 11 years old, that January 5th grade Miss Hendricks's class. though school had been delayed 2 hours for a snow advisory. She had her backpack on anyway, the blue one, with the small fox-shaped keychain she had picked out herself at a craft fair in Ellicott City, the previous fall, looped through the zipper pull. She was holding her phone, but not looking at it, just watching the door. She didn't come to me when I pushed through. She stood still and let me come to her. That stillness, careful, deliberate, too composed for 11 years old, caught me somewhere between my ribs. When I reached her, she looked up. "Mom." Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. Steadier than mine would have been at 11 or at 30 or at 58, standing in a courthouse corridor in January. "Are we going to be okay?" Not "are you okay?" She had already understood what had happened, not because anyone explained it, but because children absorb these things the way they absorb everything else. Adults think they are hiding through the changes in dinner table conversation, through fewer phone calls from her father, through the particular quality of silence that had settled into our house over the past several months. She wasn't asking me to explain anything. She was asking me if there was something solid underneath us, if I could hold it. I pulled her in. "We're going to be okay," I said into the top of her head. I meant it. I just didn't know yet whether I could prove it. She didn't argue. She tucked herself under my arm, and we stood together in the long corridor, fluorescent lights, old carpet, the faint smell of burned coffee from somewhere down the hall, and I let myself believe it for a moment. Then the door opened behind us. Rick came through, already moving, already, talking into his phone at low volume, his attorney close beside him. He walked past us without a glance, no pause, no hesitation, no acknowledgement that we were standing 5 feet away. He pushed through the exterior doors, and through the glass I watched him reach the black BMW parked directly in front of the building, say something that made his attorney laugh, and then get in and drive away. I stood there until the car was out of sight. Sandra came up beside me and placed her hand lightly on my shoulder, the way she always did when she was about to say something important, in the least conspicuous way possible. "Take the album," she said quietly. "Everything personal? Anything without a copy somewhere?" I didn't fully understand what she meant. Not yet. But I had learned over the past year to trust Sandra when she spoke in that particular tone. I reached into my bag. The photo album was there, forest green fabric corners worn soft. I had packed it that morning because Sandra told me to bring anything irreplaceable. I hadn't asked why. 412 Birchwood Lane, a leaking roof, a furnace that gave out in January, a house nobody else wanted. My name alone on a piece of paper for the first time in 23 years. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I didn't know then, standing there with Lily's hand in mine, that the photo album I had just tucked into my bag would be the only thing that changed everything. By the time Lily and I pulled up to 412 Birchwood Lane that afternoon, the sun had already gone down, not that it had shown up much to begin with. We sat in the car for a moment. Neither of us said anything. The house sat at the end of a curved cul-de-sac, half hidden behind 2 overgrown Norway spruce trees. The porch light was out. One of the shutters on the front window hung at a slight angle, the bottom hinge pulled free from the frame. And I made a mental note of it, the way you make mental notes of things you can't afford to fix yet. I grabbed a box from the back seat. Lily grabbed her backpack and followed me up the front steps without being asked. Inside the house smelled like damp wood and old carpet, the smell of a house shuttered through too many winters. The entryway opened directly into the living room, where a broad window looked out over the dead front yard. The walls were painted a shade of yellow that might have looked cheerful when it was new, sometime around 1987 from the look of it, but had faded to the color of old newspaper. The carpet was thick and brown, worn flat in the paths between rooms. In the kitchen, hairline cracks crossed 2 floor tiles, the kind that spread slowly and cost more than they look like they should. The late winter light came in through the living room window in a single long bar crossing the floor at a low angle and stopping just short of the far wall. It was the only warm thing in the room. Lily walked in behind me. She set her backpack down by the door, put her hands on her hips, and looked around the way a contractor might slowly, deliberately taking inventory. Then she said, "It's not that bad, Mom. We can fix it up." I had to turn away from her. I pretended to be adjusting something in the box I was carrying, though there was nothing to adjust. I stood with my back to her for a few seconds, pressing my lips together, and when I turned back around, my face was steady. She hadn't said it to comfort me. That was the thing. She had said it as a statement of fact, the way an 11-year-old says something true matter-of-factly, without drama. Because she had looked at the situation and reached a conclusion and saw no reason not to say it out loud. And that more than anything that had happened in courtroom 4B that morning nearly finished me. By 8 o'clock we had unloaded the car, found the light switches, and determined that the furnace worked, if reluctantly. Lily spread her homework across the kitchen table, and I sat beside her with my laptop open. My resume was last updated in 2018. I stared at it for a long moment before I could bring myself to scroll through it. 7 years old, and every line of it reflected a life I no longer lived. There were 2 entries from the early years of our marriage: a staff accountant position at a small manufacturing company in Columbus, a part-time bookkeeping role I had taken when Lily was a baby, and then 15 years of blank space during which I had managed Rick's receivables, his vendor contracts, his quarterly projections, and the full scope of his financial reporting. 15 years of real work documented nowhere under my name. On paper, I looked like a 58-year-old woman who had not been employed in nearly 2 decades. I opened a job search site and entered bookkeeper into the first field. The cursor landed in the box labeled Most Recent Employer. I hovered over it and did not type anything. Family business, I thought. That was accurate. It was also the kind of phrase that meant nothing to a hiring manager and everything to me. I clicked away without submitting. I opened my banking app instead. The balance in my checking account was $2,247.83, money I had set aside quietly over the past 3 years, transferred in amounts small enough not to draw attention. Moved into an account Rick did not know existed. It was not a safety net. It was a number I had memorized and run calculations against in the dark more times than I could count. The electric and gas bill on this house would run roughly $180 a month, based on what Sandra had told me about the property. Groceries for 2 managed carefully would come to around $400. The first child support payment of $650 would not arrive until the 15th of next month, which meant I had approximately 6 weeks before the math stopped working, assuming nothing in this house broke. Nothing unexpected came up, and everything continued to go exactly as planned. Nothing had gone as planned in quite some time. I closed the laptop when Lily started packing up her homework. We made sandwiches from the groceries we had grabbed on the way over, ate at the kitchen table without saying much, and then I sent her to get ready for bed. The furnace clanged twice, and then settled. The house made small sounds around us, the normal sounds of an old structure adjusting to the cold, but they were unfamiliar sounds which made them louder than they probably were. Lily appeared in my bedroom doorway before I turned off my lamp. She was already in her pajamas, her hair down, arms loose at her sides. "Mom." A pause. "We're going to be okay." Right. It was the second time today she had asked me that. At the courthouse she had asked once, and had not asked again. There she had been in a public corridor with her backpack on, asking in front of the world. Now she was asking in the dark, in a house she had never slept in before, in her pajamas. The difference mattered more than I could have explained to her. "Yes," I said quietly. "I promise." This time saying it felt closer to true. After she went to her room, I set the photo album on the wooden shelf beside the window, the forest green cover corners worn at the edges. Rick had found it at a flea market during the first year we dated, holding it up across a crowded table and grinning, "For all the things worth remembering." At the time that had sounded like the beginning of something. Tonight it just sounded like something that happened long ago. I turned off the lamp and lay down. The album sat on the shelf less than 10 feet away, and I found that I was not ready to open it. Maybe because opening it meant looking, and I already knew that once I really looked, there would be no pretending I had not seen what was there. That night, I couldn't sleep. And when you can't sleep in a house that still smells like someone else's past, your mind takes you to the places you've spent years trying to avoid, pulling you all the way back to a November evening in 2021, the first time I saw the number that started everything. The bedroom was cold in a way the furnace couldn't address, the particular cold of an unfamiliar room in an unfamiliar house, where the sounds are all wrong and the shadows fall at angles you haven't learned yet. I lay on top of the covers for a while, listening to the house settle around me, to the furnace cycling on and off in the basement, to what I thought was Lily turning over in the next room. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I gave up and went down to the kitchen instead. I filled a glass of water, sat at the dark table, and that was when the memory came up without being invited, the way memories do when you have no defenses left. It had been a Tuesday in the second week of November 2021. I remembered because Tuesday was payroll day, which meant the accounting system was already open, which meant I was deep in the numbers when the anomaly showed up. A transfer of $47,000 dated 4 days prior, routed to an entity called Meridian Holdings, LLC. I ran the name through every internal file I maintained. It wasn't in any vendor contract. It wasn't in any project ledger. It hadn't appeared in the quarterly reports I prepared for Rick's outside investors, or in any of the liability summaries I filed at the end of each fiscal year. I had been maintaining the financial records of that company for 15 years, and I had never once heard that name. I printed the transfer record on the small laser printer we kept in the upstairs office, the printer that always ran warm, that Lily had tried to use once in second grade to print a drawing of a horse, and gotten a toner smudge down the side of it. I folded the page in half and went looking for Rick. He was in the kitchen making coffee. He looked up when I walked in, read my expression the way he always did, quickly, completely without appearing to, and said, "Close the door." Not a question. I closed it. He didn't get up. He didn't move toward me. He set his coffee mug on the counter with the kind of deliberate calm that was never real calm at all, and then he looked at me and waited. "Maggie." His voice was even. "Everything in this company is connected. If you start pulling on one thread, the whole thing comes apart, and I mean everything. The house, Lily's school, our life." He paused. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" I understood him completely. That was the worst part. Not the ambiguity of what he had said, but the clarity. He wasn't threatening violence. He wasn't threatening me at all. Not in any way I could have pointed to and named. He was threatening the structure that held everything up, the house, Lily's school, the routines she depended on, the version of life she had grown up inside of without knowing it could be otherwise. He was saying, "I'm the load-bearing wall. Come at me and the ceiling comes down on all of us." I took the transfer record back upstairs and put it in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet beneath a stack of quarterly reports I would never have any reason to review. I stood there for a moment after I closed the drawer with my hand flat on top of the cabinet, and I told myself I was being careful, that I was waiting until I understood more, that there was a right way to handle something like this, and I hadn't found it yet. I kept telling myself different versions of that same thing for the next 3 years. Not because I didn't know what I was looking at. I did. A $47,000 transfer to an unregistered LLC in a company where I controlled the books, where I knew every line item that was not something you could talk yourself into misunderstanding. I knew what it meant. I knew what it suggested about what else might be there if someone looked hard enough. And I knew that the moment I spoke it out loud, whatever happened next would happen to all of us. To Lily especially, and she was 7 years old and she deserved to finish second grade without her life falling apart because her mother had decided it was time to stop pretending. The memory let go somewhere around 4 in the morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table at 412 Birchwood Lane, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone completely cold. The kitchen was dark except for the small light above the stove that I had switched on when I couldn't find the main switch in the middle of the night. And through the window over the sink, the street lamp cast a thin yellowish light across the front yard. Last week's snow lay in thin gray patches across the dead grass, edges softening in the slight overnight warming. It was very quiet. I thought about what Rick had said that November evening. He had been right about one thing: pull on the right thread and everything comes apart. He had just never accounted for the possibility that the life at risk of unraveling might one day no longer be mine to protect. The clock on the stove read 5:47. That meant I had just over 3 hours before I needed to be out the door. 3 hours before I walked into the first job interview I had been to since 2010. Sat down across from someone I had never met and tried to explain 15 years of work that existed nowhere on paper. I stood up, filled the kettle, and put it on the burner. While I waited for it to boil, I opened my laptop on the kitchen table and the resume was still there on the screen. Exactly where I had left it the night before. The same empty field, the same 2 entries from 15 years ago, the same cursor with nothing new to say. That morning, I had an appointment at 9 o'clock, my first interview in nearly 15 years. I did not know whether a 58-year-old woman with a resume full of white space was the kind of thing a hiring manager wanted to see across the table. But I had run out of the option to wonder about that from a safe distance. The only thing left to do was walk through the door and find out. The interview was scheduled for 9 o'clock that Tuesday morning, less than 36 hours after the divorce paperwork was finalized, and I arrived 12 minutes early because I was still that kind of person, even when everything else had come apart. Hargrove Financial Solutions occupied the 3rd floor of a building on Meridian Street, 6 blocks from the courthouse. The lobby had the particular stillness of offices that open promptly at 8 and run quietly until 5 carpeted floors framed prints of the kind nobody picks out deliberately. A reception desk manned by a woman in her mid-30s named Debbie, who smiled when I gave her my name and said, "Mr. Patterson would be right with me." I sat in one of the 4 chairs against the wall and did not look at my phone. I had dressed carefully that morning, the navy blazer I hadn't worn since Lily's 5th grade graduation ceremony. Dark trousers, low heels. I had ironed everything the night before in the kitchen with the ancient iron I found in the closet at Birchwood Lane. I had told myself I looked professional. Sitting in that lobby, I focused on believing it. Gregory Patterson appeared at 9:02. He was 55, maybe 56. With the easy bearing of someone who had run interviews long enough that the process was no longer something he had to think about. He shook my hand, thanked me for coming in, and led me back to his office with the measured courtesy of a man who had nothing against me personally. That was the part I found hardest to navigate. He wasn't unkind. He was doing exactly what the job required, reading the resume in front of him and responding to what it said. He opened the folder, scanned the first page, and looked up. "So, you handled internal accounting for a private family business. No formal employment contract, no W-2s on file, no external references." His voice was neutral, professionally calibrated. "That's correct," I said. 15 years. Accounts receivable and payable, cash flow reporting, internal audits, quarterly tax estimates, vendor contract management. I managed the full financial operation." He nodded. Not skeptically, just in the way that people nod when they are processing information that doesn't fit easily into the categories they work with. "Do you have any documentation that could be independently verified? Anything from a third-party CPA or an outside auditor?" I had anticipated the question. I had been anticipating it since 2 in the morning when I sat in the dark kitchen and rehearsed every version of this conversation I could think of. The answer was still no. I didn't have a CPA letter. I didn't have third-party verification. I had 15 years of institutional knowledge living entirely inside my own head, and none of it was transferable in the way a hiring manager needed it to be. "I don't have independent documentation," as I said. He nodded again, made a small note on the folder, and moved to the next question. We talked for 22 minutes. He asked about my familiarity with current accounting software. I mentioned QuickBooks, which I had used for years, though my version was now several updates behind. He asked about my availability. He asked whether I was open to starting in a part-time capacity. I said yes to everything because yes was the only word that made sense in that room. At the end of 22 minutes, he extended his hand and said, "We'll be in touch." I knew what that meant. I had probably said something similar myself at some point in a different life when I needed to close a meeting gracefully. It was the most professional rejection available, delivered without cruelty, leaving no room for follow-up, perfectly designed to close a door without anyone having to say the word no. I thanked him. I shook his hand. I said I looked forward to hearing from them. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before starting the engine. I did not cry. I stared through the windshield at the concrete wall in front of me and let myself think the thoughts I had been holding back since I walked into that building. I was 58 years old. I had managed the finances of a six-figure commercial real estate brokerage for 15 years. I had known those books the way a person knows the inside of their own house, every corner, every inconsistency, every place where the numbers told a story the surface didn't show. Rick had known it too. That was why he kept me close and kept me informal and never once suggested we put anything in writing. I remembered the one time I had raised it. 2012. Lily had just started kindergarten, and I had asked Rick whether it made sense to formalize my role, a proper title, a salary, on the books. Something that documented what I actually did there. He had looked at me with that particular expression that managed to be both warm and dismissive at the same time. "Why would we need a contract?" he said. "We're family." At the time, that had sounded like an answer. It had sounded like affection, like the dismissal of something unnecessarily formal between two people who didn't need paperwork to trust each other. Now, sitting in a parking garage in Fairmont Heights 13 years later, it sounded like the most precisely constructed trap I had ever walked into. Not because he had planned it from the beginning. I had stopped believing in that version of him, the one who thought that many steps ahead, but because it had served him so well for so long, and because he had never once gone back and offered to change it. The email arrived at 2:14 that afternoon. I was parked outside Lily's school waiting for the 3:15 bell. My phone buzzed against the center console, and I looked down at the subject line. "Hargrove Financial Application Update. After careful consideration, we have decided to move forward with other candidates whose experience more closely aligns with the role. We appreciate your time and wish you well in your search." I set the phone face down on the seat beside me and watched the school doors through the windshield. I drove home after pickup, listening to Lily talk about a science project involving volcanoes and baking soda, answering in the right places, keeping my voice steady. When I pulled into the driveway at Birchwood Lane, the rejection email was still the last thing on my screen. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The photo album was on the floor in the middle of the living room, fallen from the shelf, splayed open pages fanned out against the old brown carpet like it had been left there on purpose. That same evening, I almost left it where it had fallen. I was tired and I was hungry, and the last thing I wanted was to sit down with a collection of photographs from a life that no longer existed. But something made me pick it up anyway. I told myself it was just to put it back on the shelf. I carried it to the kitchen table, sat down, and set it flat in front of me. The album had fallen open somewhere in the middle, a photograph of Lily at 6, squinting in August sunlight at the edge of some lake outside the city, wearing the orange life jacket that had been 2 sizes too large for her. She had been collecting rocks that day, I remembered. She always collected rocks at lakes. I had forgotten that day entirely. Looking at the photograph now, Lily in the orange life jacket, her arms full of wet stones, grinning at something off camera, I felt the particular kind of distance that comes from knowing something has changed so fundamentally that even the memories attached to it seem to belong to someone else. I reached to close the cover. A slip of paper fell out from between the pages and landed on the table. I looked at it. A small rectangle of paper, roughly 3 inches by 2, folded once in the center. I picked it up and unfolded it. Rick's handwriting. A date. a series of initials, a dollar amount, and what appeared to be a 3-letter code I had never seen in any document I had managed. I set it on the table and looked back at the album. I turned to the next page. Between a photograph of Lily's 4th-grade school portrait and a picture of the 3 of us at Thanksgiving my parents' house. The year before my mother died, I found another slip of paper, folded the same way, same handwriting, a different date, different initials, different amount. I turned another page, and another. By the time I reached the back cover, I had a row of paper slips laid out on the kitchen table, each one unfolded and placed carefully in the order I had found it. I had not touched any of them with my bare hands after the first 2. Somewhere around the 3rd one, I had gone to the counter and pulled a square of paper towel from the roll. And after that, I handled each slip with the paper towel between my fingers and the page. Not because I had fully decided what I was doing, but because something in the part of my brain that had spent 15 years thinking about financial documentation had made the decision without waiting to be asked. 23 slips of paper in total, distributed unevenly across the album, sometimes 1 per page spread, sometimes 3 or 4 clustered together in the same section. I went back through and noted the dates. The earliest one I found was from March 2019. The most recent was from September 2023. Several of the slips had a small red line drawn through one corner, a marking I recognized immediately as Rick's shorthand for a transaction he considered closed. I had seen his handwriting in those margins for 15 years. The abbreviations were his, not from any accounting standard I knew, but from whatever internal shorthand he used for the parts of the business he tracked on his own. The kinds of numbers that passed through his mind at hours when the system was closed and he didn't want to log in. I knew what I was looking at. It took me approximately 4 minutes of sitting at that kitchen table to understand fully, and with very little room for doubt, what these slips of paper represented. Off-ledger transaction summaries. Not receipts. He would have kept those elsewhere or not at all. Just the raw data amounts, dates, counterparties reduced to abbreviations, transaction codes that corresponded to nothing I had ever seen in the company's official records. And he had kept them in the photo album. The family photo album, the one with the green cover that he had picked up at a flea market in our first year together. The album that lived on the shelf in the main living room of every house we had inhabited for 23 years. The album that no auditor, no IRS agent, no forensic examiner would ever ask to see, because it was a family photograph album, and those simply were not the kinds of things that contained financial records. Weaponizing the mundane. A phrase my father had used once, talking about a former business partner, that I had not fully grasped at the time. The idea that the most effective hiding place is never the locked safe, never the encrypted file, never the thing that looks like it is meant to be protected. The most effective hiding place is the thing that nobody thinks to look at twice because it has always just been there. I did not photograph the slips of paper that evening. I was not ready to make the decision that photographing them would imply. Instead, I gathered them carefully with the paper towel, set them back between the same pages where I had found them, closed. The album, carried it to the narrow closet in the hallway, and locked it with the small key that was already in the interior of the door. I put the key in the pocket of my cardigan and stood there for a moment in the dark hallway with my hand on the closet door. Then Lily knocked on the kitchen doorframe. "Mom." Her voice was careful, the way it had been at the courthouse. "Are you okay in there?" "Yes," I said. I moved back into the kitchen doorway so she could see me. "I'm just sorting through some things." "Okay." She held up 2 mugs. "I made tea. I didn't know if you wanted any, but I made 2 cups." She had used the good mugs, the ones with the blue pattern, the only ones I had brought from the old house that were not packed away. I took the mug she offered and sat back down at the table, and she went back to her room without making anything of it. 11 years old, and she already knew when to make tea and when to leave the room. I did not know whether to feel proud of her or heartbroken that the knowledge was necessary. I locked the closet and kept the key in my pocket. I did not know yet what I was going to do, but I knew one thing with certainty: Rick would call. He always called when he needed to remind me of something I already knew, usually framed as helpfulness. And when that call came, I needed to know exactly what I was going to say. 3 days after I found the slips of paper, Rick called. I let it ring twice before I answered, not because I was hesitating, but because I wanted to hear what he said before I decided what I would say. The 3 days had not been idle. I had gone to see Sandra the morning after I found the album, a Tuesday, overcast and cold. The kind of morning that feels like it's already mid-afternoon by 10 o'clock. I sat across from her desk with the green cover on the table between us, and I watched her face do something careful and controlled while she listened to me describe what I had found inside. She didn't touch the album. She asked me to describe each slip in detail: the dates, the abbreviations, the red line markings, the range of dollar amounts, and she wrote everything down on a yellow legal pad in a handwriting I recognized as deliberate, the kind of notes written to withstand scrutiny later. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't tell anyone else what you found. Not yet. And don't move the slips. Leave them exactly where they are, and don't let anyone in the house know they exist." I went home and did exactly that. So by the time Rick's number appeared on my screen that Tuesday morning, I was not unprepared. I was waiting. His voice was even and pleasant, the way it always was when he wanted something and hadn't yet decided whether he was going to have to work for it. "How are you settling in?" he asked. "How's Lily?" 2 sentences of warmth, deployed efficiently before he got to the point. He needed some files, he said. Old client folders from 2020 and 2021 materials related to a few commercial listings that had gone into archival status. Some of them had been packed with the household materials during the move instead of staying with the business files. He thought they might have ended up at Birchwood Lane by mistake. "Which folders, specifically?" I asked. There was a half-second pause. Not long enough to mean anything on its own, but I had spent 23 years learning the geometry of Rick's pauses. This one meant he hadn't expected the specificity of the question. He gave me 3 names. The first 2 I didn't recognize, or rather, I hadn't seen them cross-referenced in any of the slips I had found. The third one he mentioned almost as an afterthought in the same tone he used for everything else. A folder labeled Hartwell Meridian 2021. I had seen that name. Not in any system. Not in any official document I had filed. I had seen it on the 3rd slip of paper from the left side of the album in Rick's handwriting, next to a dollar figure and a date in October of that year. I let nothing change in my voice. "I'll look for them," I said. "I'm still working through the boxes. It's been a busy few days." "Of course," he said. "No rush." Then almost offhandedly, "Just before the end of the week if you can, all right, I've got some things pending that I want to get organized." I said I would do my best. After I ended the call, I sat at the kitchen table for 3 full minutes without moving. The mug in front of me had gone cold. Outside the window, the January sky was the same flat, indeterminate gray it had been for a week. He had not asked how Lily was adjusting to the new school schedule. He had asked how she was in passing in the first 10 seconds of the call, as a formality, and then he had moved on to what he actually needed. He had not asked whether she was sleeping well in the new house. He had not asked whether she had mentioned missing her old room, her old bus route, the particular view from the window she had looked out of every morning for 6 years. He had called because he needed a folder labeled Hartwell Meridian 2021 back in his possession before the end of the week. That was the actual purpose of the call. Everything else had been framing. I picked up my phone and called Sandra. She picked up on the second ring. I told her about the call, the 3 folder names, the one I recognized, the timeline he had imposed. I did not editorialize. I just gave her the facts in the order they had occurred, because that was what she had asked me to do. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Then, "Don't give him anything. Not a single page. And don't let him know what you found." Another pause. "Come see me tomorrow morning. Bring the album." We need to talk about next steps. I sat with the phone in my hand after I hung up and noticed that my hands were steady. That surprised me a little. A year ago, 6 months ago, even I would have been trembling with the effort of holding it all in. There would have been the whole familiar sequence, the shallow breathing, the feeling that the walls of whatever room I was in had moved a few feet closer, the particular exhaustion of managing someone else's expectations while trying to keep track of my own. Now I just felt clear. Not calm, exactly. Clear. Like a room with all the furniture moved out of it where you could finally see exactly how large the space actually was. Lily came through the front door at 3:40, dropped her backpack on the floor beside the sofa, and looked at me across the kitchen counter. "Did Dad call?" she said. "Yes," I said. She nodded, a single nod, chin down and back-up eyes on the middle distance. She didn't ask what he had said. She didn't ask how he had sounded. She pulled her backpack off the floor by one strap, carried it to the kitchen table, and started taking out her homework. I watched her do it. She had learned somewhere in the last few years that certain questions did not have answers worth the cost of asking. I had never taught her that. I had never had to. She had arrived at it the way children arrive at things their parents would rather they didn't have to know, quietly without acknowledgement and earlier than anyone should. That was the thing about 11. She understood enough to know when to stop. I set my phone down on the counter and looked out the kitchen window. There was a car parked at the curb across the street that I did not recognize, a dark sedan nose pointed toward the house. The engine was running. I could see the exhaust rising steadily in the cold January air. It had been there long enough that I should have noticed it earlier. The car outside turned out to belong to the neighbor's visitor across the street. I checked twice through the window 30 minutes apart, and both times it was still in the same spot in front of the wrong house. I let myself believe that explanation, because the alternative was that I was beginning to let the accumulation of the last 4 days turn a parked car into something it wasn't. By the time I finished making dinner and putting Lily to bed, the car was gone. The box was in the corner of the living room where it had been sitting since the day we moved in. It was a standard moving carton, medium-sized, sealed with a strip of brown tape that I had applied myself on the morning of the move. I had written "Misc Office Low Priority" on the side in black marker, which was the universal shorthand for "I will deal with this when everything else is handled." 4 days in, nothing else was handled, but Rick's call had changed what counted as urgent. I opened the box at 9 o'clock that evening while Lily was in her room finishing homework, and the furnace was making its usual effort against the January cold. The contents were exactly what I had expected. A tangle of charging cables, 3 staplers of varied size, a box of hanging file folders still in its plastic wrap, a collection of pens that probably didn't work anymore, 2 desk clocks, neither of which I remembered using, and a small black external hard drive roughly the size of a paperback book, in a Ziploc bag with a power cable coiled beside it. I held it in my hand for a moment. The drive was one I had purchased in 2017, specifically for off-site backup, the kind of redundancy measure that any financial manager worth their title kept in place, especially in a company with no dedicated IT infrastructure. I had set it up myself, chosen the encryption password myself, and run the annual backup routine every December from 2017 through 2023. Rick had known the drive existed. What he had not known or had not thought to ask was what specific files it contained, or where I kept it, or what the password was. I carried it to the kitchen table and connected it to my laptop. The drive mounted immediately. The main directory was structured the way I had organized it, year-by-year folders going back to 2015. Each one containing the standard set of financial documents, receivables, payroll records, vendor contracts, quarterly summaries. I opened 2016 and recognized the folder structure immediately. Everything was as I had left it. I was about to close the window and file the drive with the other things I needed to catalog when I noticed the folder at the bottom of the main directory. It was not labeled by year. It was labeled Mixed Review in all capital letters in the same sans serif font the system used for everything else. Underneath it, indented, was a single subfolder, flagged 2019 to 2023. I had not created that folder. I opened it. Inside were 47 files, a mix of Excel workbooks and PDFs, each named with a string of numbers and letters that followed no naming convention I had ever used. I opened the first one, an Excel workbook, 11 pages, formatted as an internal cash flow report. The structure was familiar because I had built the template it was based on. But embedded in the third worksheet, beginning at row 41, was a block of transaction entries highlighted in yellow. Not by the standard conditional formatting I had built into the template. Manually highlighted, cell by someone who had gone through the document looking for specific line items and wanted to mark them for later reference. I recognized the transactions immediately. They were the same category of anomaly I had found in November 2021, transfers routed through intermediary LLCs to accounts that did not appear anywhere in the company's official tax filings. The same structure, the same pattern of abbreviation in the counterparty field. Just more of them and across a wider date range, but I had not built the yellow highlights. I sat back from the laptop and looked at the ceiling for a moment. I was the only person besides Rick who had ever had access to this drive. The drive had been in my possession from the day I set it up until the day I packed it into the moving box. I had not highlighted anything in yellow, which meant that at some point, before I packed it, someone else had been in these files. Or Rick had found a way into the drive I thought only I could open and had flagged those transactions himself for reasons I could not yet determine. I kept opening files. The pattern was consistent across all 47. Money moving from commercial real estate transactions through a chain of LLCs, some of which I recognized by name. Others I didn't, before arriving in accounts that had no corresponding entries in the quarterly tax estimates I had prepared and filed on Rick's behalf. The amounts varied. Some were modest, others were not. Added together across 4 calendar years, the total was not the kind of number that resulted from clerical error. I closed the laptop at 11 o'clock. Lily was asleep. The house was quiet. I had spent 3 years telling myself that what I had found in November 2021 might be explainable. A misclassification? A timing difference. One of the dozen legitimate reasons that money sometimes appears in the wrong column before it finds the right one. I had told myself that often enough, in enough different forms, that the telling had become its own kind of habit. What I was looking at now was not explainable in that direction. There were too many of them over too long a period, following too consistent a structure. There is a particular kind of queasy clarity that arrives when something you have known a long time finally agrees to be seen. I picked up my phone and looked at Sandra's name in my contacts. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I had more than enough to bring with me. I set the drive on the kitchen counter beside my laptop and went to bed. In the morning before I left for Sandra's office, I opened my banking app to check the account balance and schedule the internet payment that had been on my list since the day we moved in. I looked at the number on the screen. I looked at it again. And then I looked at it a third time because the first two hadn't made sense. It wasn't that the balance was dangerously low. It was that the account showed a transfer I had not made outgoing, dated 2 days earlier for an amount that left the balance at $247, and some change, a number I had carefully maintained, now reduced without my authorization. January the 15th was the day the court order designated for the first child support payment. I checked my account at 7:14 in the morning. There was nothing there. Not a pending transfer. Not a processing delay with a note attached. Not even a trace in the transaction history to suggest something was on its way. The balance was $247.16, exactly what it had been the night before, minus the $41 that had disappeared in the unauthorized transfer I still hadn't fully processed. If I was being precise about it, the $247.16 was what remained after paying the electric bill on the 13th. That was the number standing between Lily and me, and the next time I would need to buy groceries. I set the phone face down on the kitchen table and looked at the window. The January light was doing its usual thing, arriving flat and low and not particularly committed to anything. Lily had already left for school. I had made her eggs and toast and watched her eat with the particular focused attention of a person who is determined to appear normal. I checked the account again at 8 o'clock. Still nothing. I checked it a third time at 9:45. The number on the screen remained what it had been. Sandra had warned me that Rick technically had until the close of business to transmit the payment and remain within the language of the order. I knew that. I had written it down in the notes file I had started on my phone, along with the date and time and the expected amount, and the current received total, which was 0. Knowing the technical parameters of a situation and sitting in a kitchen with $247 in your account while your 11-year-old is at school are two different kinds of knowing. I called Sandra at 10. "He has until 5 o'clock technically," she said. "But document everything: the date, the time, the expected amount, exactly what you have or don't have in the account. If the payment doesn't come through by close of business, we file for contempt of court first thing tomorrow morning." A pause. "Are you all right?" I said I was managing. I sat in the kitchen after I hung up and looked at the table. The $247 was not a dramatic number. It was not the kind of balance that appeared on the news or in the stories people told about financial collapse. It was just a number that, when held up against the cost of food and utilities for 2 people in January in the Midwest, meant approximately 10 days if nothing went wrong. If something went wrong, it meant less than that. I had run the number in various configurations over the past 5 days, the way I ran numbers by instinct, adding the expected child support in, subtracting it out again, calculating how long each version lasted. Every version eventually arrived at the same ceiling: not long enough. On the corner of the table, Lily had left a drawing from the night before. She had been doing some kind of art project, had gotten absorbed in it at the kitchen table while I was on the laptop, and had left it when she went to bed, a full sheet of white paper-colored pencils still scattered beside it. 2 figures standing in front of a house with a triangular roof and 4 square windows. One taller figure, one smaller. Below them, in the steady, deliberate print of a 5th grader who had been taught to make her letters even Mom and me. Our house. I looked at it for a moment. The house in the drawing had curtains. 3 of the 4 windows had flowers on the sill. Lily had apparently decided that our house, the one she had described on the day we arrived as "not that bad, we can fix it up," was a house with flower boxes. She had drawn the life she intended to have, rather than the one currently in front of her, which was something I recognized as a skill I had once had myself, and had let go of somewhere along the way. I did not cry. I picked up the drawing, folded it in half carefully, and put it in the kitchen drawer, where I was keeping things I needed to hold on to. Then I opened the Notes app on my phone and typed January 15th, 7:14 a.m., no payment received. That was what it was. Whatever else it was, an act of spite, a tactical choice, a simple oversight that I did not believe was simple, or an oversight. The record of it was now 7 words in a document that would eventually become part of something larger. I had spent 15 years managing financial documentation. I knew what a paper trail was and how one got built. This was how it got built, one line at a time, one date, one fact that could not be walked back. Sandra called again at 8 the next morning. "Before you come in," she said without preamble, "I want you to know I ran a public property record search on Birchwood Lane last night." She stopped there with the particular pause of someone choosing how much to say over the phone. "There's something you need to know about the house. We'll talk when you get here." Another pause. "And I have someone I need you to meet at 2 o'clock this afternoon." I asked who. "Someone whose work overlaps with yours," she said. "That's all I want to say on the phone. Just be there at 2. I set the phone down on the kitchen table. The drawer was still slightly open from when I had put the drawing in. Mom and me. Our house. I pushed the drawer shut and stood there for a moment with my hand on the counter, looking at the closed drawer, thinking about what Sandra might have found in a public property record that required a phone call instead of waiting 45 minutes. I didn't know what was in that record. I didn't know who Sandra wanted me to meet. But I had been managing uncertainty long enough to know that the fact of not knowing was not the same as being unprepared. I had the album. I had the drive. I had 7 words typed into a notes file at 7:14 in the morning. I had a record of an unauthorized bank transfer. I had a paper trail that was still small, but entirely factual, and factual was what mattered in a courtroom. That same morning, Sandra's office was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled of coffee and old carpet, and she was already waiting when I arrived, door open, 2 mugs set on the table between us. The office was a room that had made peace with being functional rather than impressive. 2 tall filing cabinets along the east wall bookshelves that held more binders than books. A whiteboard with several columns of handwriting that I couldn't read from where I sat. The desk was clear except for a legal pad, a yellow highlighter, and the folder I recognized as the one Sandra had started when I first came in 11 days ago. On the table between us, she had set a second folder thinner, which I had not seen before. I sat down. She slid 1 mug across to me and wrapped both hands around her own. "Show me," she said. I took the photo album out of my shoulder bag. The slips of paper were still inside in their original positions, each one now nestled inside a small plastic Ziploc bag that I had found in the kitchen the morning after I discovered them. Sandra had not asked me to do that. I had done it because it was the obvious thing to do, and because the part of my brain that had spent 15 years handling documents had taken over before I fully understood why. Sandra opened the album to the first marked page. She looked at the slip inside the plastic bag without touching it, tilted the page toward the light from the window, and read. She moved to the next page, then the next. I sat across from her and watched the expression on her face do nothing in particular, which was its own kind of information. 10 minutes passed without either of us saying anything. At the end of that time, Sandra set the album down on the table, folded her hands on top of it, and looked at me. "Maggie," she said, "do you understand what this is?" "Yes," I said. She nodded slowly. "Do you understand what it means for you specifically given where you were in relation to this company?" I had thought about that. I had thought about it at 11 o'clock the night before, and again at 4 in the morning and on the drive over. "I was the internal accountant," I said, "which means the question is going to be why I didn't report this earlier." "Exactly." Sandra uncapped her highlighter and set it down without using it. "You worked inside that operation. If you go directly to the IRS with this material, they will want to know why it took you this long to come forward. The answer that you were under pressure, that you had a dependent child, that you were in a financially controlled relationship, those are real answers. But they need to be documented and presented in a specific order." She paused. "There is a program designed for exactly this situation. IRS Form 211. The Whistleblower Program. It allows a person with inside knowledge of tax violations to report formally, with legal protections in place, and it establishes on the record the circumstances under which the person remained silent. That is how we protect you before we do anything else." I had heard of the program. I had not known it applied to someone in my position, a former internal employee, an undocumented one at that, who had seen something in 2021 and had not acted. Hearing it described in Sandra's office with the album on the table between us made the whole thing feel less like a secret I had been carrying and more like a document I had been waiting to file. "Okay," I said. "Walk me through it." She did. When she finished, she reached across to the thinner folder, the one I hadn't seen before, and opened it on the table. She set a single printed page in front of me. I recognized it immediately as a county public property record, the kind generated by a UCC and lien database search. At the top, in the header field, 412 Birchwood Lane, Fairmont Heights. "There is a lien on this property," Sandra said. "Filed in 2021, Rick used 412 Birchwood Lane as collateral for a commercial loan $180,000 through a private lender. This was never disclosed in the divorce proceedings. I looked at the page. The filing date was March 2021, nearly 3 years before Rick had agreed in a courtroom I was also present in, to transfer the property to me as part of the settlement. A lien, I repeated. What does that mean for me practically? Sandra looked at me directly. It means that if Rick defaults on that loan, if the private lender decides to collect, they can move against the collateral, which is your home. You could lose the house. She let that sit for a moment. But it also means that Rick concealed a material liability from the court during divorce proceedings. That is not a paperwork error. That is grounds to reopen the settlement agreement. I sat with that for a long moment. The mug in front of me had gone cold. He had given me a trap and called it an asset. He had handed me a house with a $180,000 lien attached. Signed in 2021, the same year I had found the $47,000 transfer to Meridian Holdings, and he had told me that pulling one thread would bring everything down. And I had signed the papers in January and moved in on January 10th and hung the album on the shelf and told Lily we were going to be okay. What do we do with this? I asked. We document it. We add it to the Form 211 filing, and Sandra closed the folder and looked at me steadily. The person I want you to meet at 2 o'clock this afternoon, his name is Dan Reeves. He's a forensic accountant. He works with attorneys on exactly this kind of case. He's going to look at what you found on that drive and tell us what we actually have. I nodded. Maggie. She waited until I looked at her. What you brought in this morning combined with what I found in those county records, this is not nothing. I want you to understand that. I drove from Sandra's office to the address she had given me for Dan Reeves, with one question that I could not get out of my head. If the house was a trap? If Rick had given me a liened property knowing exactly what was attached to it, then how many other pieces of the settlement had been designed the same way? How many things had he agreed to in that courtroom in front of a judge and a stenographer, and my signature that he had already arranged to take back, before I understood what I had accepted? Before I reveal exactly what Dan found inside those flagged files, and I promise you, the numbers are worse than anything Maggie imagined. Drop a 58 in the comments to let me know you're still here with me. That number will mean something by the time this story is over. And a note: parts of this story include fictional elements built for illustration. If this isn't for you, it's okay to step away now. No judgment. 2 hours later, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I walked into Dan Reeves's office, a room deliberately arranged to be unimpressive. 1 desk, 2 chairs. A whiteboard dense with abbreviations I could only half recognize, and a framed CFE certificate on the wall that he had not once mentioned. Dan Reeves was 52, with the particular build of someone who had spent decades at a desk and made no apologies for it. He had gray at his temples and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the contained, unhurried manner of a person whose job required that everyone else in the room slow down to his pace. He shook my hand, thanked me for coming in, asked if I wanted water. I said no. He said fine, and sat down and held out his hand for the drive. I gave him the hard drive. He connected it to his laptop with a cable he already had laid on the desk, the kind of setup that suggested he had been briefed in advance and had arranged accordingly. He scanned the main directory, navigated to Mixed Review, and opened the flagged 2019 to 2023 subfolder without asking me to direct him. He had already been told what to look for. He opened the first file and read. He opened the second. He moved through them methodically, without commentary, scrolling at the pace of someone reading for content rather than appearance. After approximately 15 minutes, he asked me to lay the album open on the table across from him. He looked at the slips through their plastic bags, page by page, pausing at several, making small marks on his legal pad. He did not ask any questions. He did not react visibly to anything he read. He simply worked. in the quiet and efficient manner of someone practicing a skill he had been practicing for a long time. 40 minutes passed. Dan set his legal pad down, stood, and uncapped a marker. He divided the whiteboard into 3 columns. In the first column, he wrote, Shell LLC transfers. In the second, unreported income. In the third, asset transfer VH. I looked at the third column. 2 letters. The abbreviations were familiar Rick's style, the same shorthand I had been reading for 15 years. But the initials themselves I had never seen in any document. VH. I said it aloud, not quite a question. Dan turned from the whiteboard. Vanessa Holt. Public County Deed Transfer Records. Rick transferred ownership of 2 commercial properties to her name in the 8 months before he filed for divorce. He said it the way a person states a fact that has already been verified and simply needs to be delivered. Standard pattern for this kind of case. Move the valuable assets out of your name before the proceedings begin so the court doesn't see them. Legally, it's called a fraudulent transfer. We can file a civil petition to have those transfers reversed. I had not known her last name before that moment. Holt. I sat with it for a second, the way you sit with information that fills in a shape you already had without knowing it was incomplete. I knew her first name. I had known it for months, the kind of neighborhood talk that reaches you before you decide whether you want to hear it. A name mentioned in passing by someone at the old address, a name I had filed under things I was not ready to think about yet. Holt was new. Holt was a county record. It was the difference between a rumor and a document. The child support figure, I said. The $650. Dan turned back to the board and wrote a number in the second column. What he reported as his income and what these records indicate he was actually earning are not close. Based on what I can see here, the number should be between $2,400 and $2,800 a month. The $650 was calculated on a declared income that was significantly understated. He capped the marker. We file for modification. Minimum 3 to 5 months before a hearing, longer if he contests. But the record is there. I nodded. And the IRS filing. Form 211. Intake review takes 30 to 60 days. That's just for the IRS. To assess whether the submission meets the threshold for a formal examination. After that, if they open an investigation, we're looking at months, possibly longer, but the clock starts running from the date of submission, which means every day we wait is a day that doesn't count. He sat back down and looked at me across the desk. You need to understand that this is not fast. None of it is fast. But the record we're building right now today, this week, is what makes everything else possible. He was 52. I was 58. There was something in the way he spoke to me, not as a client he needed to manage, but as a colleague whose competence he had already assessed and found adequate, that made the conversation feel different from the one I'd had with Patterson 11 days ago, or from most of the conversations I'd had in the past 3 years. He was not explaining things to me in order to establish that I didn't understand them. He was explaining them because he knew I did. I sat with everything he had laid out and felt the shape of it settle. Rick had not kept me informal for 23 years because he was careless. He had kept me informal because I was useful inside and untraceable from outside, and because the moment I had any documentation of my own role, I also had documentation of everything else. The thing about 15 years of financial documentation is that you develop a particular relationship with pattern recognition. You learn to see the shape of a structure before the individual entries make sense. I had been looking at Rick's patterns for 15 years and telling myself I didn't understand what I was seeing. I had understood. I had simply not been ready to do anything with the understanding until now. He had never been afraid of me because I was powerless. He had been afraid of me because I knew too much, not just the numbers, but the shape of the numbers, the way the money moved and where it was designed to disappear. And it had taken me until this particular Tuesday afternoon in this particular unimpressive office to fully understand exactly how much that actually was. Dan picked up his pen and looked at his legal pad for a moment. Then he set it down and looked at me. "There's one more thing, Maggie. About the house on Birchwood Lane." He paused. "Sandra told me about the lien, but there's something she didn't find in the county records. Something I found this afternoon. I already knew about the lien Sandra had told me that morning, but the way Dan had said, something she didn't find, told me this was going to be worse than a lien." I was right. He sat down across from me and set his legal pad flat on the desk. "What I found goes beyond the lien itself," he said. "The lien is a problem, but the problem isn't the lien, it's what wasn't disclosed. When Rick filed the loan documents in 2021 using 412 Birchwood Lane as collateral that created a material encumbrance on the property. State disclosure law requires that any existing encumbrance on jointly held marital property be declared in the asset schedule filed with the court during divorce proceedings. He turned the legal pad so I could see the line he had underlined. "It was not declared. This isn't an oversight. The loan predates the divorce filing by more than 2 years. Rick signed a sworn asset declaration in October of last year and did not include it." I looked at the underlined entry. The loan origination date, March 2021. "If he defaults on that loan," Dan continued, "the private lender has documented security interest in the property. They can initiate foreclosure proceedings. You would have the right to contest, but contesting takes time and resources, and the lien has legal priority. There's a meaningful risk you could lose the house." I sat with the geometry of it for a moment. Rick had agreed to transfer 412 Birchwood Lane to me in the settlement. He had sat across from me in a courtroom and signed a document saying the house was mine. At the time of that signing, he had known since 2021 that there was a $180,000 loan secured against it that I had no knowledge of. He had given it to me the way you give someone a gift that has already been pawned. He thought it was his final move, I said, not a question. Dan's expression didn't change. "It may have been designed as one, yes, but..." I said it because I could hear there was one. "But..." Dan leaned forward slightly. "The undisclosed lien isn't just a problem for you. It's exactly the category of material omission that gives your attorney grounds to petition the court to set aside the settlement agreement entirely. Rick declared sworn assets and concealed one. That's not a clerical issue, a court takes that seriously. The entire property division, the child support calculation, the maintenance terms, all of it becomes subject to reopening." He paused. "The trap he set for you just became evidence against him." I looked at the whiteboard. 3 columns. Shell LLC transfers. Unreported income. Asset transfer. VH. And now, a 4th category that Dan hadn't written up there. Because it didn't need to be written, the house itself turned inside out. There is a particular kind of satisfaction that has nothing to do with happiness. It is the feeling of a structure you couldn't quite see finally revealing its own architecture. I had been standing inside Rick's design for 23 years without understanding the blueprint. Sitting in Dan Reeves's office at 4 in the afternoon, I could see the whole floor plan for the first time. I had started this month with $2,247.83 in savings, a navy blazer I hadn't worn in 6 years, and the working assumption that my position was weak. That assumption had been based on a misunderstanding of what weak actually meant. I had been operating inside a structure designed to make me feel powerless. That was not the same as being powerless. "What do I do right now?" I asked. Dan picked up his pen. "Right now, we start building the record. Stage by stage, carefully, legally, completely. Sandra files the contempt motion for the missed child support today or tomorrow. The Form 211 goes in as soon as we finish the documentation within the next 2 weeks, ideally. The fraudulent transfer petition and the motion to reopen the settlement move in parallel." He set the pen down. "This doesn't move in a straight line, but every piece we file creates a record, and the record is what holds." I nodded. I understood records. I had been building them for 15 years, one entry at a time. I drove home at 5 o'clock. By the time I reached Birchwood Lane, the sky had gone fully dark, the kind of dense January dark that arrives early and stays. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine and sat in the car for a moment without getting out. The house looked small from the outside. It always did. But through the thin curtain of Lily's bedroom window, there was a warm rectangle of yellow light, the lamp she always turned on the moment she got home, because she said the room felt bigger with it on. I had never thought about why she always said that. Now I thought maybe she understood something about light that I had only just started to learn. I was 58 years old. I had no formal employment record, no independently verified professional history, and a checking account with a balance I checked 3 times a day out of habit and anxiety. I was 3 months into what was legally called an equitable settlement, and factually was something considerably closer to a designed disadvantage. I did not have the time or the resources to start over from nothing. What I had was a hard drive and album, a yellow legal pad full of notes from this afternoon, and a forensic accountant who had said the word evidence in a way that meant he had seen it before and knew what to do with it. That was what I had. It was enough to start. I got out of the car and went inside. Lily was on the sofa with a library book open across her knees, her feet tucked under her, in the way she had sat since she was small. The reading lamp was on beside her, not the overhead light, just the lamp casting that particular warm pool of yellow she always preferred. She looked up when I came in, and something in her face shifted. Not with alarm, just with attention, the kind of careful watchfulness she had developed over the past year. "Mom, Dad called while you were out." She paused. His voice sounded different. I set my bag down on the kitchen counter. "Different how?" Lily was quiet for a second. She turned it over the way she turned things over methodically, the way she counted the change from her allowance, or laid out her homework before she started it. She chose her word with the deliberateness of an 11-year-old who had learned that precision matters. "Scared," she said. 4 days after I met with Dan was the strangest kind of waiting, knowing something was moving beneath the surface, but not yet being able to see it. Sandra was filing paperwork. Dan was building the case documentation, and I was doing what I had always done best, keeping the house running, helping Lily with her homework, and pretending for my daughter's sake that everything was still within manageable range. Those 4 days had a particular texture. I woke early each morning and checked the Notes app on my phone, the one I was filling with dates and amounts and observations, and then I made breakfast and drove Lily to school and came back to the quiet house and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the legal pad I had started carrying everywhere. I read through what Sandra had filed. I answered Dan's questions when he texted them. The paperwork moved at the pace. Paperwork moved. I could not hurry it. What I could do was be ready when it needed me. On the evening of January 20th, Lily came home quieter than she usually was. She put her backpack down with less energy than normal and sat at the kitchen table without reaching for her homework. Just sat there looking at the table, with the expression of someone in the middle of working something out. I let her sit for a few minutes before I said anything. I had learned over the past few weeks that Lily did better when I let the silence go first. "How was your day?" I asked. She was quiet for another moment. Then, Dad called at lunch. I set my mug down. "Okay." He was talking to me, and then another call came in. He said sorry and said he'd switch over for just a second, but he didn't. He didn't turn off our call. He was still talking to me, but he was also on the other line. I could hear him. She said this carefully, the way she said things she had been practicing in her head. I waited. He was talking louder than normal. He said, She paused, then repeated it precisely the way she repeated things she had memorized. "What do you mean frozen, all of it?" And then he said, "How long? I need to know how long." I said nothing. Lily looked up at me. "Mom, does frozen mean Dad lost money?" 11 years old. She had parsed a half-heard conversation through one side of an accidentally unmuted phone call and arrived at the correct conceptual category. She hadn't asked whether anything bad had happened. She had asked for clarification on a specific financial term. I sat down across from her. It's a word adults use when there's a problem with a financial account, I said. It can mean different things in different situations. Ah, she nodded, processing that. Our kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street and then it was quiet again. Lily looked back at the table for a moment. Then she looked up at me with the particular directness she reserved for questions she had already decided to ask, regardless of the answer. Is it because of what you found, Mom? I went still. Not because the question surprised me, it didn't, not entirely, but because of what it revealed about how much she had been paying attention. Not to specific documents or legal proceedings. To me. She had been watching me move differently through the house over the past 10 days, carrying things in my bag I hadn't carried before, making calls after she went to bed. She hadn't asked. She had waited. And now she was asking directly because she had decided she needed to know. She knows I'm doing something I thought. Not the details. But she knows there's something happening, and she knows it involves her father, and she knows I'm the one moving the pieces. I'm trying to make sure that we're protected, I said. I made myself hold her gaze while I said it. That's all you need to know right now. Okay. She looked at me for a moment the way she looked at things she wasn't done considering. Then she nodded a single decided nod and reached across the table for her backpack. She pulled out her math homework. She did not ask anything else. She hadn't accepted the answer because it satisfied her. She had accepted it because she had decided to trust me with the part she didn't know. That was a different thing, and it cost her something, and I was aware of both. She was 11. I kept reminding myself of that, the way you remind yourself of a fact you need to stay factual about. She should have been spending her mental energy on long division and library books, and whatever the social dynamics of 6th grade looked like this week. She should not have needed to develop the skill of knowing when to ask a question and when to choose trust instead. But she had needed to, and she had, and I was going to make sure it was worth it. After Lily went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table for a while with the legal pad in front of me. What I had just heard, what Lily had heard accidentally, through an unmuted phone call, was information I hadn't had before. Rick's financial accounts were showing distress serious enough that the word frozen had entered his vocabulary. Whatever Sandra and Dan were filing something in Rick's financial architecture was responding. I didn't know exactly what. I knew that the system had started to feel the pressure. I called Dan at 9:10. What she heard is consistent with what we're seeing in the civil records, he said when I told him. He didn't ask me to repeat it or verify it. He just absorbed it the way he absorbed financial data quickly and without unnecessary reaction. Things are starting to move. Stay the course. I wrote that down on the legal pad before I went to bed. Stay the course. I had been staying courses for 23 years in a house that turned out to have a different structural foundation than I had believed. I was reasonably good at it. This time, I intended to stay the course in a direction I had chosen myself. 2 days later, at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday evening, my phone showed a text from Dan. I read it twice before I responded. There's a networking event this Thursday evening. The Fairmont Heights Commercial Real Estate Annual Mixer. Rick is on the host committee. He's publicly confirmed his attendance. Registration is open. A pause between messages. Then, I think you should go, Maggie. Call me. I set the phone on the counter and looked at it for a long moment. Then I called him. In the nearly 2 weeks between when the divorce was finalized and that Thursday afternoon, I had applied for 2 more jobs. Both rejections arrived within 48 hours, had submitted the first round of paperwork Sandra needed, and had learned that the kitchen faucet at 412 Birchwood Lane dripped exactly once every 4 seconds when the furnace kicked on. I knew this because I had counted lying awake at 2 in the morning, trying to decide whether walking into a room full of Rick's professional contacts was the bravest or most foolish thing I had ever seriously considered doing. Dan's reasoning when I called him Wednesday night had been precise and unsentimental. Rick's name on the host committee was public. He had confirmed attendance through the event's own digital registration system, which was visible to anyone who signed up. Dan had signed up to check the list not to attend. He had 3 specific names he thought I might encounter contacts whose business relationships with Rick appeared in the financial records we had been building. If any of those 3 were present and I could confirm it with my own memory, people I recognized from the 15 years I had spent managing the books that was corroborating information. Not testimony, corroboration. I wasn't going as an agent. I was going as a person with eyes and a memory and a name tag. The blazer was in the back of the closet in dry cleaning plastic still sealed. I had bought it in the spring of 2019 for a conference I had ended up not attending. Rick had needed me at the office that weekend, and I had hung it in the closet when we got home from the dry cleaner and had not thought about it again. It was a navy blazer, well cut, the kind that doesn't announce itself. I pulled it out of the plastic and held it up in front of the mirror on the closet door. It still fit. Some things had not changed. Lily appeared in the doorway behind me. She had her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She had only recently started needing them for close work, and she kept forgetting they were there, which gave her the air of someone considerably older than 11. She looked at me in the mirror, tilted her head slightly to one side, and considered. "You look like a boss," she said. "Like an actual boss. Not like a mom going somewhere." I turned around. That might be the nicest thing anyone has said to me this month. She grinned and went back to her room. Patricia had called me that morning. We had been friends since our freshman year of college, one of those friendships that contracts and expands across decades without ever quite breaking. The kind you pick back up with a single phone call after a year of silence and find immediately familiar. She lived in Fairmont Heights, had for the past 12 years, and had mentioned once before that she volunteered occasionally at registration tables for local professional events. She had seen the mixer listed in the Chamber of Commerce newsletter. "I already signed up to work the registration desk," she told me. "I saw Rick's name on the committee list when I was setting up." "You will not be walking in there alone, Maggie. I will be at that table." I had not asked her to do any of this. She had simply done it in the way that Patricia did most things, without making it into a favor, without requiring acknowledgement, simply because it was what the situation called for. I told Lily I'd be home by 9:30, that Mrs. Alderman next door knew I was going out and was available if she needed anything, and that there was lasagna in the refrigerator. Lily nodded at each item like she was taking notes. She had already packed her school bag for the following morning, something she had started doing without being asked, sometime in the past 2 weeks. I noticed she did most things without being asked lately. I thought about the other events I had attended with Rick over the years. He had a preference for standing at the center of these rooms, not the loudest person, but the most connected. He moved between conversations with practiced ease, always knowing whom he needed to speak with next. I had stood beside him at those events for 15 years, and in that time I had become fluent in the particular social grammar of being the person next to the main event. I had been introduced as his wife. I had contributed appropriately and at the right volume, and had known when to step back. I was not Accountant Maggie at those events. I was Rick's wife. They were not the same thing. I had not fully understood how different they were until I was standing in front of a closet mirror in a rented house with a navy blazer I had bought 4 years ago, getting ready to walk into one of those rooms alone. Tonight there would be no one beside me. No one to make the introduction, no one to determine which conversations I entered or exited. I would have to say my own name in my own voice to people who might remember me from a different context or might not remember me at all. I looked at myself in the mirror and said it out loud. "Maggie Callahan, bookkeeper, Fairmont Heights." I said it the way you say something you're not sure you believe yet. Too small, too apologetic at the edges. I said it again. "Maggie Callahan, bookkeeper, Fairmont Heights." Better. I said it a third time and then a fourth, adjusting the weight of it, not louder, just more grounded, the way a fact sounds when you've stopped asking permission to state it. 58 years old, I thought. Standing at a mirror practicing introductions like a freshman orientation. I genuinely did not know whether to find that funny or devastating. Probably both. I kept going until it sounded like what it was a true statement about a real person. I parked on Caldwell Street 20 minutes before the event started and sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. Then I picked up my bag, walked through the parking lot, and pushed open the glass door of the Meridian Event Hall. The room was already half full, voices and light and the particular hum of a professional gathering in full motion. Patricia was at the registration table by the entrance. She saw me immediately and gave a small, deliberate nod. I found my name tag. I clipped it on. And when I looked up, Rick was standing in the middle of the room, 3 conversations deep in a group of 6 people already looking straight at me. He had seen me at exactly the moment I had seen him. Before I tell you the 6 words Maggie said to Rick, the 6 words that ended 23 years in one quiet sentence, type ending in the comments. I want to know who stayed long enough to hear this part. A note: some details in this story are fictional, shaped for understanding and reflection. If you'd prefer a different kind of content, it's okay to close out here. No hard feelings. The Fairmont Heights Commercial Real Estate Annual Mixer was held at the Meridian Event Hall on Caldwell Street, a room I had been to at least a dozen times over the years. Always standing slightly behind Rick, always introduced as my wife, before I had the chance to say my own name. Patricia handed me my name badge at the registration table with a look that communicated several things without saying any of them. 3 deep on the left when you walk in, she said quietly. That's the cluster he's already working. I looked. She was right. Rick was holding court near the far windows, animated, comfortable, the most natural person in every room he was ever in. I took my badge and my glass of water and walked in. The room had changed and not changed. Same long rows of high tables, same caterer, same smell of coffee, and, whatever the venue called, proximity to deals. What had changed was the angle from which I was seeing it. I'd stood in this room as an extension of Rick's professional identity for so long that seeing it from my own 2 feet felt like looking at a familiar photograph from a different elevation. During the first 30 minutes, I moved through the room the way Dan had suggested, observing, not initiating unless approached, using the natural circulation of a cocktail event to position myself within range of the 3 names he had given me. I recognized 2 of them immediately. Gerald Whitmore, who had signed the Hartwell Meridian LLC paperwork in 2021, and Thomas Brent, whose name appeared in 4 of the yellow highlighted files on the hard drive. Both here, both on the same side of the room as Rick. I noted the time on my phone. That was what I had come to do. Rick found me after about 30 minutes. He didn't make a scene of it. He was too practiced for that. He walked over with his glass in hand, nodding to someone on the way, and positioned himself slightly to my left in the particular way that had always directed me away from other conversations. He kept his voice low enough that only I could hear. "What are you doing here, Maggie?" "Networking," I said. "Same as you." He smiled. It was the smile he used when he was buying time. "We should talk. Privately." "No," I said. "I think we've had enough private conversations." His jaw moved slightly. Not anger. Rick didn't do visible anger in professional settings. Recalculation. He shifted his weight and put his hand on my shoulder lightly, the way you touch someone you're trying to present as an ally, and leaned in just slightly. "Maggie." His voice dropped another register. "Don't do something you'll regret." There it was. I had heard those words in that sequence, in that specific register, more times than I could count across 23 years. He had said them when I found the first anomaly in 2021. He had said them during the months before the divorce papers were drawn. He had said them, I understood now, every time I had come close enough to see clearly, and it had always worked. And the reason it had always worked was that I had always had something to protect, and he had known exactly what it was. Lily. It was always Lily. In 2021, it had been Lily. During the months of the divorce proceedings, it had been Lily. He had understood that I would not risk her stability for a clarity I wasn't even sure I could achieve. That calculation had been correct, until it stopped being a calculation I could afford to maintain. I looked at him. I was aware of the glass in my hand steady. Of the room around us, people in their own conversations, unaware and unconcerned. Of the particular sensation of having made a decision that is fully made with nothing left to deliberate. "I'm not doing anything, Rick," I said. Quiet. Even. "I just stopped protecting you." He stood there for a moment. His expression did not collapse. Rick was not the kind of person whose expression collapsed, but something behind it shifted. The way a calculation changes when a variable is removed. He looked at me once more, then turned and walked back the way he had come. And I stood in the middle of the Meridian event hall holding my water glass and felt the world tilt very slightly on its axis. Not with noise, not with drama, just a quiet, permanent reorganization of weight, the kind that happens when something that has been holding in one direction for a very long time is finally released. I found Vanessa Holt without looking for her. She was across the room near the event registration board speaking to a woman I didn't recognize. She was well-dressed, the kind of careful, considered dressing that suggested she understood exactly what rooms like this required. She was also watching Rick from the corner of her attention, the way people watch someone they think they know better than the room does. As if she could feel what had just changed from 40 feet away, even though she hadn't heard a word of it. Then she looked at me. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. She didn't look away first, and neither did I. I didn't know exactly what she knew about the filings, about the lien, about the property transfers with her name on them. I didn't know how much Rick had told her, or how much she had simply understood by proximity. What I could see in the 2 seconds we looked at each other across that room was that there was no victory in her expression, just calculation. And underneath the calculation, something that looked a great deal like concern. Patricia appeared at my elbow. "Are you all right?" "Yes," I said. "First time in a long while, yes." I stayed for another 40 minutes. I spoke to 3 people I hadn't met before, gave each of them my name and my professional background without stuttering, and had one genuine conversation about bookkeeping software with a woman who ran a small property management firm and was looking for a freelancer. She took my number. I took hers. I drove home with a business card in my coat pocket and a feeling I hadn't had in so long, I almost didn't recognize it, the sense that I was specifically myself. My phone rang before I reached the first intersection. It was Patricia. I answered. "Maggie." She paused. And in that pause, I heard the particular quality of someone who has been carrying something for too long and has finally calculated that the weight of not saying it is greater than the weight of saying it. "I need to tell you something about Vanessa. I've known for 2 years." I pulled over on Caldwell Street, still running, the engine turned up the heat, and listened to what Patricia said without interrupting once, because there are some things you have to let a person finish before you can decide how you feel about them. She told me on the phone. It was late past 9, and I sat parked against the curb with the heater running and the street empty around me, and watched the light from a coffee shop across the street until she was done. 2 years ago, at a dinner with a group of mutual acquaintances, women she had known from a professional association, the kind of gathering that fills a Tuesday evening without being the kind of thing either of us would have described as significant, someone had mentioned Rick. A man who had been at a regional real estate conference in Columbus. A man who had brought the same woman he's always with now, according to the person who'd said it, with the particular careful tone of someone who assumes everyone in the room already knows. Patricia had not known. She had listened, and afterward she had done what Patricia did when she needed to be certain about something. She had asked questions quietly of people who moved in overlapping circles until she had a name. Vanessa Holt, independent real estate broker, Franklin County, based with a client list that overlapped significantly with several of Rick's commercial properties. "I didn't tell you," Patricia said, and in the long pause before she continued, I heard the particular weight of 2 years. "Because I wasn't completely certain, and because I didn't want to be the person who broke something that might already be fragile from a different angle. I was afraid you wouldn't believe me, or that you'd confront Rick and things would get worse before I knew whether I was right. And I was afraid. She stopped. Then, I was afraid you'd blame me. I sat in the parked car and said nothing for a moment. There was a kind of tiredness that came with this particular piece of information that had nothing to do with the hour. It was the exhaustion of adding up a long column of numbers and arriving at a total you had suspected, but not confirmed. Rick had known. Patricia had known. An entire room of professional acquaintances in Columbus had known in the practiced casual way of people who have filed a fact under "not my business." And I had been the last person in the equation to arrive at the total. I told her we would talk in the morning. We met at a coffee shop on the corner of Warren and Fifth at 8 o'clock. The place was the kind that had been there for 20 years, same menu, same mismatched chairs, same persistent smell of espresso and old timber. We sat across from each other with 2 cups between us and let them go cold in the way you do when what's in front of you is more demanding than caffeine. In person, Patricia looked the way people look when they have not slept. She was 58, and she had the particular exhausted clarity of someone who had made a decision the night before that couldn't be unmade. She told me everything she had told me on the phone, and then she told me more. She had known since January of 2023. She had seen Vanessa Holt in person at a Chamber of Commerce event that spring. A woman she hadn't known was significant until she was standing 40 feet away in a room full of people, and Patricia had recognized her from a photograph someone had forwarded in that original dinner conversation. She had not introduced herself. She had gone home and spent 6 weeks deciding what to do with the knowledge. And then she had decided to do nothing, and had been doing nothing ever since, and had lived with that decision in the specific low-level way you live with something you know is not finished. "I know," she said. "I know I should have told you." I looked at my coffee cup. The morning light through the window was thin and flat January doing what January did. "You should have told me," I said. My voice came out calmer than I expected. "Whatever it would have meant for me, whatever I would have done with it, you should have told me. It was mine to decide." Silence. "I know," she said again. She did not try to explain further. That was the only thing that she didn't try to explain further that kept me from standing up and walking out. She looked at the table for a moment. Then, "There's one more thing. Last week I heard through the same person, someone who moves in the same circles, that Vanessa has been consulting a private attorney about the properties, the ones in her name." She paused. "I think she knows the situation is becoming dangerous for her. I think she's preparing to get out." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Last night, after the event." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Because I saw you walk into that room," she said. "I was at that registration desk and I watched you walk in alone in that navy blazer, and you looked like someone who had made a decision that was already made. And I thought..." She stopped. "I thought I owed you the same thing." I looked at her across the table, this woman I had known since we were 20 years old, who had watched from a careful distance and chosen silence. I was not going to tell her it was all right, but I understood the fear. I had lived in a version of the same fear myself for 23 years. That didn't make her silence right. It made it recognizable. I drove home afterward and thought about choices. Rick had made his a specific kind of greed that required the systematic undocumentation of the people around him. Patricia had made hers silence, out of fear and uncertainty, and the particular cowardice of wanting things not to be as bad as they were. Vanessa Holt was making hers right now in an attorney's office, calculating her own exit. And I had made mine on January 10th when I moved into 412 Birchwood Lane with Lily and ran out of other people's choices to accommodate. There was an envelope on the front step when I got home. Sandra's office return address in the upper left corner. I picked it up and opened it standing on the front porch in the cold. Inside was a single printed page. At the center of the page, 3 words Sandra had underlined in red, "filed today." Below it, in her handwriting, the same careful unhurried hand I recognized from every document she had given me a short note. Now we wait. The 2 weeks between submitting that petition and the first morning of February were full of small things, none of them dramatic. Lily's history project spread across the kitchen table. A first appointment with Dr. Carol Bennett that I had somehow managed to schedule. A leaking pipe under the kitchen sink that I fixed myself with a 40-minute YouTube tutorial, and a feeling of satisfaction that was equal parts practical and something harder to name. And then February arrived and things began moving in ways I could only see from the outside, through emails, through phone calls, through words that other people carried to me. I should say what Dr. Carol Bennett was: a therapist, 61 years old, who worked out of a small office on Birch Street with no particular specialty listed on her website except life transitions. I had found her through a pamphlet at the library, which was the kind of thing I would not have let myself do 18 months ago. I had not told Lily where I was going for the first appointment. I had said I was running an errand, and Lily had nodded with the particular nod of a child who has learned that adults sometimes need imprecise language. Early February, Patricia called on a Tuesday evening. "Vanessa hired a lawyer last week," she said. "She's trying to move the properties back into her own name, separate from anything Rick controls. I heard Rick is very upset." "Key," she said it in the same careful tone she had used at the coffee shop, the one that had replaced whatever tone she used to use around this subject. "I thought you should know." I wrote it down: February 4th, 7:38 in the evening. Patricia confirms Vanessa retained private counsel. Assets being repositioned. Rick's reported response significantly agitated. I logged it in the notes file the way Sandra had asked: dates, sources, observations, no editorializing. The record was the record. The email from Sandra arrived the following week. The IRS had confirmed receipt of the Form 211 submission and had logged it for initial intake review. The formal 30 to 60-day intake window had begun. No further action would be taken or communicated at this stage. That was the language, but the submission had passed the first threshold and was now formally in the system. Sandra's note at the bottom was brief. "This is what the first step looks like. It doesn't feel like much. It is." I had been wondering what the first step towards something this large would feel like. The answer was an email. 2 sentences of bureaucratic language, a reference number, and a date. I printed it and put it in the folder with the other documents. 3 days later, browsing the local news on my laptop after Lily was asleep, I found a brief article in the Fairmont Heights Gazette. 18 lines buried past the business section, about a commercial real estate firm under review for undisclosed transaction irregularities. The article named the firm. It did not name Rick directly. But I had managed the books for that firm for 15 years. I knew the company name the way you know any place you have spent a significant portion of your adult life inside. I printed the article. I read it twice. Then I walked to the kitchen and found a thumbtack in the junk drawer and pinned it to the cabinet door next to the refrigerator, the same cabinet where Lily had been sticking her school schedule and her permission slip since we moved in. It was a small thing, but it was the first time I had pinned my own history on a wall, rather than filed it or concealed it, or waited for someone else to tell me what it meant. The article belonged to me. The fact in it had been there for years, but the record of it was mine now in the specific and irreversible way that public records are. Late February. Sandra called me into the office on a Thursday afternoon. The court had formally received the petition to reopen the property division settlement, acknowledged, docketed, assigned a case number. The child support modification hearing had been calendared June 17th. Rick's attorney had been notified. The process had a schedule now, which meant it had weight. "This is normal process," Sandra said from her side of the table. "Not fast, but the direction is right." I nodded. I had been nodding at the pace of paperwork for 2 months. I was getting good at it. The first week of March, Dan called me into his office. I sat across from him in the same 2 chairs we had used in January, the same unimpressive room, the same CFE certificate quiet on the wall. He had a folder open on the desk. Rick's commercial brokerage license is under administrative review, he said. Initiated by the state licensing board. And separately, one of his primary business partners filed a civil complaint in Franklin County last month. The complaint alleges misrepresentation of shared assets over a 3-year period. He set the folder down. It appears you were not the only person he was managing in that manner. I sat with that for a moment. The window in Dan's office looked out on a parking lot and a gray March sky. I watched a pigeon settle on a concrete barrier and decide it was satisfied. I did not feel victory. What I felt was closer to the particular quiet that follows a sound that has been going for a very long time. Not its absence exactly, more like what it feels like when you realize the absence is real, that the thing that was pressing in one direction for years has finally stopped pressing. The wall I had stood in front of for so long was no longer there. What was on the other side of it remained to be determined. I drove home at 4:30 and made dinner and helped Lily with a grammar worksheet and watched 30 minutes of a nature documentary she had become very interested in. At 9 o'clock, after she went to bed, I opened my laptop. Not to check email, not to look at case files. I opened a freelance marketplace I had found through Dan's referral, a professional platform for independent bookkeepers and accountants, and navigated to the profile creation page. The form asked for a name, a professional description, a service area. I typed Maggie Callahan, bookkeeping services, Fairmont Heights, Ohio. I filled in the rest of the fields. I wrote 3 sentences describing what I did and how long I had been doing it. They were accurate sentences. I read them back. Then I moved the cursor to the save button. I had deleted versions of this form before, not this one, but others. The resume started and closed. The profile begun and abandoned. I had gotten used to the motion of beginning and stopping. I clicked save. I did not delete it. Gloria Marsh found me through Patricia, who it turned out had been telling anyone who would listen that her friend Maggie was very good with numbers and very reasonably priced. Which was both accurate and slightly embarrassing to hear secondhand. The freelance profile had gone live on the 1st of March. By then, I had also sent emails to 4 people whose contact information I had collected at the annual mixer, the woman with the property management firm, 2 building owners, and a mutual acquaintance of Patricia's who ran a small construction supply business. I had explained what I offered, listed my rates, and attached a 1-page summary of my experience, which I had written and rewritten 6 times over 2 evenings before deciding the 5th version was the most honest and the least apologetic. The profile had its first inquiry within 4 days. It was Gloria Marsh. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in early March, with 2 large canvas tote bags hanging from both arms, the kind of organized chaos that only reveals itself once emptied. She set both bags on my kitchen table and stood back from them with the expression of someone who has been carrying a physical weight and is choosing to set it down in the presence of the person they've decided to trust with it. 11 years, she said before I had even offered her coffee. I've run my shop for 11 years. I've never once understood my own taxes. My accountant retired last year and I've been completely underwater since then. She paused. Patricia says you're the person. I looked at the bags. Other people would have seen chaos. I saw a filing system that hadn't been labeled yet. Receipts by vendor. Invoices by date. Quarterly estimates somewhere in there, probably mixed in with the mileage logs. A handwritten notebook, the kind with the coil spine that likely contained a running record she had kept herself in her own shorthand. That would need to be translated but would be, I suspected, fairly accurate in its instincts. People who keep notebooks like that usually have good instincts. They just don't know how to build the structure around them. Tell me about your shop, I said. She sold artisan home goods, candles, ceramics, locally sourced textiles. She had a physical storefront on the east side of Fairmont Heights, a small online presence she managed herself. 2 part-time employees and 1 seasonal. She had deducted what she thought she should and guessed at the rest. I made a coffee while she talked, then sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a calculator, and we began. We worked for 2 hours. It was the particular kind of work I had been doing in one form or another, across 2 decades, the work of finding the shape inside the pile. Gloria was a good collaborator. She had questions, but she asked them at the right moments when something I said didn't match something she had thought she understood. She had the notebook in her lap, and she wrote things down in it without being asked. When I explained the difference between a business expense and a cost of goods sold, she nodded in the deliberate way of someone who has just correctly identified why something hadn't made sense to her for years. By the second hour, we had sorted the previous year's receipts into 6 categories, identified 3 deductions she had missed, and sketched out a rough system for how she would organize going forward. She had been managing her books the way you manage something you don't fully understand, with good intentions and improvised logic. The bones were there. They had just needed someone to read them. "You're very good at this," Gloria said. She was looking at the sorted stacks in front of her, 8 months of receipts, now legible now with a pattern. "I know," I said. 2 words. I said them without thinking, without the half-second of recalibration I had spent for most of my professional life, inserting between the thought and the statement. The pause where I would locate the appropriate amount of hedging. I was 58 years old. I had been managing financial records since I was 35. I knew what I was good at. And I was sitting across from a woman who had just watched me do it for 2 hours, and the honest answer to what she had said was, "I know." I thought briefly of a conference room in Hargrove Financial and a man named Patterson, who had spent 22 minutes not quite looking at me. That had been a job I had applied for because I had needed a job. What was happening at this kitchen table was something else entirely. Gloria paid me $150 for the session and scheduled a weekly appointment. She picked up her sorted stacks with visible satisfaction, returned them to one of the canvas tote bags in an order that had not existed when she arrived, and said she would see me next Wednesday. I walked her to the door. She drove away in a blue Honda with a small ceramic bird hanging from the rearview mirror. I went back to the kitchen and stood at the table for a moment. The calculator was still there. The legal pad with my notes. Gloria's copy of the organizational framework I had sketched out. A freshly labeled folder I had made from my own supply of manila folders and a black marker. This was not a large office with a view and a nameplate and an HR department. It was a kitchen table in a rented house on Birchwood Lane with a tablecloth that had faded flowers on it, and a window that rattled when the wind picked up. But the work that had just happened at this table was real, and the check on the counter was real, and the name on the invoice I had written, Maggie Callahan Bookkeeping Services, was mine. I was still standing there when Lily came in at 5:30, backpack slung over one shoulder, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead again. She stopped in the kitchen doorway, looked at the table, looked at the organized materials, looked at the folder and the calculator and the legal pad. She did a slow survey of the whole setup in the methodical way she surveyed most things. Then she nodded the same single decided nod she had given me in January, when she had chosen to trust me instead of asking more questions. She pointed at the corner of the table. "It looks like a real office now, Mom." I looked where she was pointing. I had been looking at this kitchen table for 8 weeks. I had seen the tablecloth with the faded flowers, the junk drawer beside it, the cabinet door with the Gazette article pinned on it. I had not once seen what Lily was seeing. I looked again. And for the first time I saw it too. By the end of March, my kitchen corner had accumulated 3 clients, a secondhand filing cabinet I bought for $40 at a garage sale on Maple Street, and a handmade sign that Lily produced one Saturday afternoon using purple marker reading "Mom's office, please knock." She had drawn a small star next to the "please." I didn't know why that detail made me cry, but it genuinely did. The 3 clients were Gloria Marsh, who came every Wednesday with her canvas tote bags and her coil spine notebook; Marcus Webb, who ran a small restaurant 2 blocks off the commercial strip and had been referred through the woman I met at the annual mixer; and Diane Hooper, who had run a licensed home childcare for 7 years and came to me after her previous bookkeeper moved out of state. 3 clients, 3 weekly appointments. A filing cabinet with 3 labeled folders and a system I had designed in a single evening that was clean, portable, and expandable. The income for March was $890. I wrote it at the top of a fresh page in the same careful handwriting I had used to log dates and amounts in January, when the balance in my checking account had been $247. $890 was not comfortable, but it was the kind of number that, set next to where I had started, showed you something real, not a destination, but a direction. I could see the road from here. Sandra's email arrived in the last week of March. The child support modification hearing remained on the calendar for June 17th. The IRS intake review was ongoing, still within the expected window. The motion to reopen the property settlement had been acknowledged by Rick's attorney. "This is a marathon, not a sprint," Sandra wrote at the bottom. "You are exactly where you should be." On a morning in that last week of March, I walked through the house slowly. Lily had left for school at 7:45. The house was quiet in the particular way it was quiet when it was only mine. I started in the back hallway and worked toward the front. The floors were still old. The living room walls were still that particular shade of yellow that I had decided on the day we moved in was not so bad in the right light. The bathroom ceiling still had the hairline crack. None of that had changed. What had changed was in the specific details of each room. Lily's wall above her desk had 3 drawings taped to it, including the one she had made of this house triangular roof. Flower boxes on every window, which I had returned to her from the kitchen drawer in February, because it belonged to her more than it belonged to any drawer. There was a succulent on her windowsill she'd bought with her own money and watered with precise, unhurried regularity. The kitchen had the smell that a kitchen gets when it has been used consistently, and with intention coffee in the morning, the warmth that lingers after the oven has been on. I noticed it now in a way I had stopped noticing on individual mornings, the way you stop noticing the temperature of a house you have been inside long enough. It smelled like a home. I was not sure exactly when that happened. And at the corner of the kitchen table, the filing cabinet, the legal pad, the 3 labeled folders, and on the cabinet door, the purple sign with the small star next to please. I had cried when Lily showed it to me. Not out of grief, it was something closer to the particular sensation of being seen specifically, and without ambiguity, by the person whose opinion of you matters most. Lily had looked at the corner of a kitchen table in a rented house and seen an office. She had made a sign for it. She had drawn a star, because Lily put stars on things she considered important or deserving of care. I was 58 years old. I had spent 23 years inside a marriage that had required me systematically, and without ever saying so directly, to make myself smaller than I was, professionally invisible, financially untraceable, personally dependent in ways I hadn't fully understood until I was standing in a courtroom, signing documents that confirmed the shape of what my invisibility had been worth. I had spent 4 months rebuilding from $41 a rented house, with yellow walls and a navy blazer that hadn't been worn in years. I had believed for a long time that 58 was too late to start over. Not consciously, I had never said it out loud. Never let it form into a complete sentence, even in the 2 a.m. thoughts that came with the dark and the dripping faucet. But it had been operating underneath everything as a baseline assumption that the math no longer worked, that the window had closed. Standing in my kitchen on a late March morning in 2025, I understood that the assumption had been wrong. Starting over didn't require youth. It didn't require a long runway or perfect timing. It required one decision, and then the next one after that, and then the daily undramatic act of following through. I had made the first decision in January, sitting across from Sandra with the photo album in my bag and the hard drive in my coat pocket. I had made every decision after that. I did not know what the summer would bring. I did not know what the IRS would decide, or how the June hearing would go, or whether 412 Birchwood Lane would ultimately be a house I kept or lost. These were things I could not control. Here is what I knew, standing in that kitchen on the last Wednesday morning of March 2025. My name is Maggie Callahan. I am a bookkeeper. I have been one in one form or another for 23 years, and beginning on the 1st of March of this year, officially under my own name. I am the mother of Lily, who is 11 years old and draws stars next to words she considers important, and who told me this house wasn't that bad on the day we moved in, and who chose to trust me when she could have asked more questions. I am not Rick's wife. I have not been in any meaningful sense for longer than I care to calculate. And for the first time in 23 years, there is not a single person in this building, in this city, in this life, who is defining any of those things for me. I heard the back door and looked up. Lily stood in the kitchen doorway, backpack still on. She had forgotten something. "Mom, what are you doing?" "Just looking," I said. "Looking at what?" I took a moment. I looked at the floors and the yellow walls and the purple sign. I looked at the window that rattled when the wind came through and the 3 folders with 3 names on them, and the Gazette article thumbtacked to the cabinet door, and the faded flowers on the tablecloth that I had stopped meaning to replace. "Home," I said. Lily looked around the kitchen once, the same slow, methodical survey she gave most things. Then she nodded, grabbed what she'd forgotten from the counter, and went back out the door. I stood there for another moment. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, opened the legal pad to a clean page, wrote the date at the top, and got back to work. This is the story I keep coming back to. She was 58 years old. She had $247 in her bank account, a house she might not be able to keep, and a resume full of gaps that no one in a standard hiring process wanted to read. And she made a choice, not in a dramatic moment, not because everything had lined up correctly, but in a rented kitchen at 2 in the morning, counting the seconds between one drip of a faucet and the next. I keep asking myself the question she never quite says out loud. At what point do you stop protecting something that was never really protecting you back? I don't have an answer. I think that might be the point. If this story meant something to you, leave it in the comments. I read every single one. If this family drama story taught me anything, and I say this as someone who lived it, it's that silence is not the same as peace. I spent 23 years telling myself I was protecting my family. What I was actually doing was protecting a lie. Don't be like me. Don't wait until there is $41 in your account and your daughter is drawing flower boxes on a house you don't own. You deserve to know the truth of your own life before it becomes evidence in someone else's legal file. I'm not a perfect person. I made mistakes I'll spend years understanding. But I believe, and I say this once, that God doesn't put you inside a burning house and ask you to stay. At some point, you are meant to walk out. Of all the family revenge stories I carry with me, honest family revenge stories, not the clean invented kind, this is the one I come back to most. If a family drama story like this one speaks to something you already know, trust that recognition. You are not imagining it. This is also the kind of family drama story that deserves to be shared. If family revenge stories like Maggie's have ever made you think about your own life, leave a comment. I read every one. Pass this on to someone who might need it. And if you'd like to stay for what comes next, subscribing takes a second and means more than you know. Thank you for staying until the very end. One last note: the stories ahead contain some fictional elements crafted entirely for reflection and understanding. If that's not the content you're looking for, step away. No hard feelings. But if you're staying, I'm glad you're here.
That's where the story ends. Thanks for being here. I will see you in the next one.